Happy Easter, everybody, from all of us here at the Hoplite channel, which would be myself. Yes, for the faithful, welcome back to the Hoplite channel. We are here to see and discuss Covid-19, the Great Reset, Part 4, A New Hope. No, definitely not. No, it's not A New Hope. This will be the conclusion episode for our four-part series of Covid-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab. As I just said, happy Easter, everybody. I'm filming this on Easter night. I hope you had a good one with your family and friends. For those who celebrate, and for those who don't, I hope you had a pleasant Sunday nonetheless. But anyway, we are going to discuss a topic of a very serious nature, of course, and it would be the book, Covid-19, The Great Reset, by our esteemed colleague, Klaus Martin Schwab. Yeah, we're finally done with the book. It took me a long time to get through it. I apologize. I know this has been a long time coming, but in any event, you could go back and watch from part 1 through 4 for the entire, I guess, saga of the book. And maybe it's easier to get a gist of what was going on by watching them all together. I noticed that the videos have been throttled back progressively. I want to say part 3 that we did a couple weeks ago has only had 60 views, give or take, and the previous 2 had over 100. But yeah, I've got my Karl von Clausewitz series of On War, and that's got, I think, over 5,000 views now. So I could talk about, something like, war or the theoretical nature or practice of it. But when I talk about a book that was written 3 years ago dealing with a pandemic that is technically still going on, although not really. If I talk about that stuff, they gotta pump the brakes on your boy Hop when he talks about that. But nevertheless, I'm going to say what I got to say. I'm not going to mince words. I'm not going to tailor or censor my own speech, because I'm positive that this platform will do that for me regardless. So yeah, let's jump into the timeline for 2022, because I covered 2021 and 2020 for the previous episodes, and then we'll discuss the readings to take us out. Right, so January 1st of 2022, we see that New York State reports the highest number of new COVID cases, 114,000, give or take, since the pandemic began. Now that's interesting, right? This timeline, of course, is taken from the CDC website, so it's not me making it up. I got it straight off the CDC. New York State, which still, I think, I'm not, if they have relaxed it, I could be wrong, but they had one of the most strict vaccination, masking, and social distance policies of any state in the union. Well, I would say between, it's always New York, New Jersey, and California that basically hate you and your freedom. So New York was definitely top of the list for vaccine requirements and for testing requirements. But the state is reporting 114 new cases, which is the highest since they started counting, which is strange because the vaccine exists, right? Well, let's continue on. January 3rd, 2 days later, the USA reports 1 million new COVID-19 cases, being the highest total of any country in the world. And at this point, I looked this up, over 60% of Americans have had one or more vaccine dose by this time. So this is all very peculiar, would you say? We've got New York, which has one of the most strict vaccination and masking policies, reporting the highest number since the COVID pandemic began. And then we have the USA as a whole, right? The crown jewel of the Western world, the United States, is reporting 1 million new cases, the highest of any country. And at this time, over half of Americans have at least one dose. So what gives, right? Well, January 24th, we find out that Omicron, the Omicron variant, right? And the memes wrote themselves when they came up with that name. The Omicron variant is reported to be 99% of new COVID cases. So what does that tell you? All the people getting new COVID diagnoses in this period from January to, well, the end of January, were most likely getting sick with Omicron. So the vaccine was doing no good for this variant. Oh, you had the first vaccine. Yeah, that's only good for, the first variant. Oh, you only had the booster for Delta or for Gamma. Doesn't cover Omicron. So all of that literally in 2 years, well, less than 2 years, because the pandemic really didn't hit the States until mid-March of 2020, already obsolete. Okay, so moving on to March the 5th of 2022, the World Health Organization reports 10 billion COVID vaccine doses have been distributed worldwide. And that means approximately 56% of the global population has had one or more doses of the Covid-19 vaccine. Okay. I want everyone to remember that. March 5th of 2022, so today is April 9th of 23. It's like a year and a month ago, 56% of the population of the globe has had one or more vaccine. I don't know how accurate that is. I pray it's an overestimation because like I said, and I know this is going to get me censored like pronto, is that we do not know half of what any vaccine, be it Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, etc. We don't know what half of what these things are capable of doing in our bodies because none of them have gone through all 3 phases of FDA clinical trials. And there's a reason the clinical trials take years, is because those phases take time. They have to get data from all of these different types of people who, for whatever reason, volunteer to be in the testing groups. You need a placebo control group, you need a testing group, and then you need evaluators. And you want to do it double blind, so you don't want them knowing which group they're in, and you don't want the testers knowing which group is getting the placebo and who's getting the actual medicine. That's how you get valuable data. That's the scientific method. It's tried and true. 56% of the population at this point has had one or more doses, and none of those vaccines have gone through any of the 3 phases. If anything, they were maybe halfway through phase 1. People, I'm telling you, in 5 to 10 years from now, we are going to see things happening throughout the world that will seem like they just came out of nowhere. And I'm talking about physical ailments, I'm talking about early death, I'm talking about abnormal disease, strange cancers, like shop of horrors stuff. And it's going to happen as a consequence of what we did between March of 2020 and March of 2022. Mark my words. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope I can watch this video 5-10 years from now and laugh at myself like, yeah, you were Chicken Little, the sky was falling, right? But I don't see how this ends well. And we're already seeing there are reports of early death in several of the Western countries, like spiking off the charts. Like early death in certain age groups where you should not see it is all of a sudden popping up. And all these researchers are you seeing this? I'm getting this. Are you getting that? Yeah, have him double check it. Yeah, the math is good. It's like, yeah, the math is good. You're not like imagining it. People are dying early, and you want like what? Us just to believe that it's just, well, it's just one of those things. Like people in their 20s are now dying. Like they weren't before, and now they are. But don't look at us because we're not at fault. Like the people who pushed all this stuff, they will just evaporate. If it ever comes to a point where people are saying to themselves, maybe it was because of all this that people are now dying. And because we rushed through this, we're now left with lifelong consequences. I think that's going to happen. It is happening right now. And I think, like I said, in 5 to 10 years, when these things start to manifest, and it's the worst things in life that come back at you that formed over time, like slow growth cancers, ailments that come back and like wreak havoc on you are things that, were part of your habitual life, right? Like going out in the sun, like for 5 hours a day every day. It's like, what do you think is going to happen to your skin? Smoking a pack of cigarettes every day for 35 years. What do you think is going to happen to your lungs? Getting a vaccine that did not go through 3 phases of clinical trials, and that is still in your body interacting with your biochemistry for all those years. What do you think is going to happen? All right, I digress. April 22nd, COVID-19 is listed as the number 3 killer in the US behind heart disease and cancer, which is still undefeated. Right, so April 22nd, roughly a year ago, we find out that COVID is killing people, but not at the same rate as heart disease or cancer, right? So what does that tell you? Heart disease and cancer are always at the top of the list. So if this is a civilization-changing event with this pandemic, don't you think heart disease or cancer would take the number 2 or 3 slot? If not both, maybe one would be number 2 and COVID would be 1. No, they both still were the number 1 and number 2 killers. And how many of those people who had heart disease as a pre-existing condition or cancer didn't get treatment because COVID was, the cause celeb? How many of these people didn't go to the hospital? How many of these people didn't go get PET scans? How many of these people didn't go get CT scans? How many of these people didn't go see their doctor just for regular checkups for their blood pressure or for their medication because, well, we all had to lock down and we were all in this together alone? How many of these people died from heart disease and cancer that otherwise wouldn't have if we had just faced the pandemic like grown-up men and women and said, people are going to get sick, we're going to get through it, but these people will die if we don't treat them? How many of those people, maybe you know a few, maybe you have friends who had family members who went through this that died early or died because and didn't have to because of all the other stuff going on? Plenty. Okay, June 10th. This is an interesting stat. I don't know why the CDC put this in here, but I have an idea. They said that the global N95 mask market is expected to be worth $11.8 billion by the year 2026. So they're already forecasting way back in June of 2022 that by 2026, the N95 mask market will be worth over $11 billion. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China, right? We're talking about COVID-19 and this is a pandemic. It's like, what do I care about the N95 mask market? Well, it has everything to do with COVID-19 because big medicine became big business literally overnight in 2020. And now they're saying, well, N95 masks is going to be worth like $11.8 billion. You might want to add that to your portfolio, right? Call your stock advisor and your broker and see if he can get you in on that sweet N95 action. Like they're telling you out loud, basically without, putting like too much of a, I guess like they're not like spiking the football, but they're telling you, hey, global N95 masks are going to be worth almost $12 billion in less than 5 years. It's like they're happy that their industry is making all this money, and you're going to be the consumer because you're scared out of your wits, aren't you? You're going to buy a box of N95 masks. You might not use 90% of them, but you will have bought them, right? The vaccine's big business. That makes them money. All of this PPE and sanitization, these things generate revenue for hospitals and for pharmaceutical companies. So yeah, that stat was put in there by the CDC because they're pumped about that. That I bet you that N95 mask market in 2019 was worth like maybe $500 million. They're saying it's going to be worth almost 12 in 6 years since the whole thing started. Yeah, that's what they're telling you. We're making the money. All right. And then July 8th, this is the last stat on the CDC timeline for 2022. It's like nothing happened after July 8th, or they just didn't feel like updating the chart anymore. But they said the FDA fully approves the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine for ages 12 through 15. And like I said earlier, this vaccine, among all the others, is still in phase 1 of 3 for safety and efficacy testing. Right. July 8th, 12 to 15-year-old kids were given the green light by the FDA to go get their COVID vax, and they know damn well it's not through phase 1 of their clinical trials, which all vaccines prior to COVID had to go through. And if you ask anybody who knows anything about that system, phase 1 and 2 are where 95% of all medicines, vaccines, pills, you name it, fail. And they never make it to market because they're not safe or they don't do what they claim they do. So why would we give these to people and risk their health if they're not safe and they don't even do what they claim to do, right? I think the Pfizer COVID vaccine concluded phase 1 at the end of March of this year, right? But back in July, the FDA was just ready to give them was ready to finally make it official. Even though the emergency use authorization had been pending for all that time, they said, yeah, to hell with it, we'll just approve it for 12 to 15-year-olds. And I want to say the fatality rate of kids between 12 and 15 for COVID is like less than 0.1%. Like a 14-year-old kid is going to deal with COVID the way you deal with like a day of bad allergies. And you want them to get a vaccine that hasn't, at this point, even gone through phase 1 of FDA testing. But the FDA, you know what? If they're going to say, hey, it's all good by us, it doesn't have to go through our tried and true tests, well, you know what? Then maybe they know better than I do. But that was the last bullet point that the CDC put on their website for this timeline. And for me, that's scary that they didn't feel like mentioning anything after July 8th of 2022. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get to the reading, shall we, of COVID-19, The Great Reset. And we'll read some passages by Mr. Schwab, who covers the pandemic, but as we talked about in earlier parts, this book is not really about the pandemic. It's about the opportunity the pandemic presents to men like him and members of the World Economic Forum and world governments in general. All right, let's jump to page 178. This is under the micro reset. And Mr. Schwab said, trends like telemedicine or remote working that expanded extensively during the confinement are unlikely to retreat. For them, there will be no return to the status quo that prevailed prior to the pandemic. Telemedicine, in particular, will benefit considerably. For obvious reasons, healthcare is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world, a fact that inevitably slows the pace of innovation. But the necessity to address the pandemic with any means available, plus during the outbreak, the need to protect health workers by allowing them to work remotely, removed some of the regulatory and legislative impediments related to the adoption of telemedicine. In the future, it is certain that more medical care will be delivered remotely. It will in turn accelerate the trend towards more wearable and at-home diagnostics, like smart toilets capable of tracking health data and performing health analysis. Equally, the pandemic may prove to be a boon for online education. In Asia, the shift to online education has been particularly notable, with a sharp increase in students' digital enrollments, much higher valuation for online education businesses, and more capital available for edtech startups. The flip side of this particular coin will be an increase in pressure on institutions offering more traditional methods of education to validate their worth and justify their fees, as we expand upon later. The speed of expansion has been nothing short of breathtaking. In Britain, less than 1% of initial medical consultations took place via video link in 2019. Under lockdown, 100% are occurring remotely. In another example, a leading U.S. retailer in 2019 wanted to launch a curbside delivery business. Its plan envisioned taking 18 months. During the lockdown, it went live in less than a week, allowing it to serve its customers while maintaining the livelihoods of its workforce. Online banking interactions have risen to 9% during the crisis, up from 10%, with no drop-off in quality and an increase in compliance while providing a customer experience that isn't just about online banking. Similar examples abound. All right. So yeah, he's talking about this is the fourth industrial revolution, right? You've got telemedicine, you got telework, you got teleeducation, you've got, Uber Eats. You don't got to go and buy groceries. You don't got to go to the restaurant. The restaurant will come to you. You don't have to go see your doctor. You can talk to him on Zoom. You don't got to go to your high school, algebra class. You can do it over Teams. And all of these things are being accelerated because of this little virus called Covid-19. But I underlined this certain section there, and I think you probably heard my my voice have an inflection when I read it. He said trends towards more wearable at-home diagnostics, like smart toilets capable of tracking health data and performing health analysis. So when you go to take a dump, your toilet's going to narc on you, right? Your toilet is going to process, whatever passes out of you and into it, and basically do a rundown on your health. Will it be a smart toilet? Will it be able to communicate via Wi-Fi to the authorities? Will it be able to communicate to your doctor without you knowing? I mean, he's talking about wearable diagnostics, but now we're talking about smart toilets. Do you want that in your house? I mean, yeah, there's the benefit of like, oh, I was really sick and I had no idea. I just thought I had, the cold. Turns out I had, super COVID. Thank God my toilet, started to beep and flash and the siren went off and said, you got to get help right now, dude. It's like, what you just put in the toilet, you're sick, like in a bad way. It's like, all right, well, that's good. But then all the other stuff, like it could just compile data on you from your turds. Do you want to live in that world? Do we have a choice? Most TVs now are smart TVs. I don't know any major manufacturer now who doesn't make a smart TV. And I think you probably have to ask to find a TV that's made modern, in the modern era, that's not smart, that doesn't have a camera or a voice sensor built in. So maybe toilets in the future will all be smart and you won't have a choice. Like you'll have to go on Craigslist and find some, weird subculture of people who sell old, fashioned porcelain toilets that do nothing but flush. You might have to go that route to keep your privacy. So it might be going that way. All right, let's move on to the next section. This is under Micro Reset again, and we are page 183, Governments and Business. Klaus wrote, in addition, in the coming months and years, a regime change might occur when policymakers take on a substantial portion of private sector default risk. When this happens, governments will want something in return. Germany's bailout of Lufthansa epitomizes this sort of situation. The government injected liquidity into the national carrier, but only on the condition the company constrains executive pay, including stock options, and commits to not paying dividends. Better alignment between public policy and corporate planning will be a particular focus of attention in terms of greater government interference. The scramble for ventilators during the peak of the pandemic epitomizes why. In 2010, in the U.S., 40,000 ventilators have been ordered through a government contract but were never delivered, largely explaining the country's shortage that became so apparent in March of 2020. What led to this situation of scarcity? In 2012, the original company that had won the bid was bought, in somewhat dubious and obscure circumstances, by a much larger manufacturer, a publicly traded company also producing ventilators. It later emerged the purchasing company wanted to prevent the original bidder from building a cheaper ventilator that would have undermined the profitability of its own business. This company dragged its feet before eventually canceling the contract and ultimately being acquired by a rival. None of the 40,000 ventilators were ever delivered to the U.S. government. It is unlikely that this sort of situation will reoccur in the post-pandemic era, as public authorities will think twice about outsourcing projects that have critical public health implications, or indeed critical public implications, security or otherwise, to private companies. The bottom line, the maximization of profit and short-termism that often goes with it is rarely, or at least not always, consistent with the public goal of preparing for a future crisis. Okay, so he's talking about a regime change and how governments are going to have to get involved, right? Because these pesky businesses are putting us all at risk. That's happening right now. I mean, like I covered in the last episode for part 3, you got SVB Bank collapsing. Signature Bank was essentially taken over by regulators. It actually wasn't failing, but the government just didn't like what they were up to. So it just said, yeah, we're going to seize your assets and essentially dissolve your bank while SVB is collapsing as distraction. So we got governments already getting interfering in the private sector, like with no hesitation whatsoever. And he's talking about Germany bailing out Lufthansa, but like not letting the businesses pay out stock options and dividends. So That's state appropriation of private property. That's socialism. That's what it's called. There is no other term for it, right? That is the proper term. It is where the state involves itself in public business. Communism is when the state just is tired of playing the game of socialism and just appropriates all businesses under its regime, and these businesses operate only with the approval of government oversight. The ventilator story, I don't know if that's true, because he's talking about a company buying a smaller company, and then during March of 2020, when everybody was begging for ventilators, even though we later found out that maybe actually harmed people, that going on a ventilator was probably not the correct treatment. Despite that, this company, he's saying, dragged its feet because it bought a smaller company and didn't want to put their cheaper ventilator on the market. I'll tell you something. If the US government wants something you have, they will write up the language in a very legal and formal way to explain to you why they're seizing it. And it's going to be essentially eminent domain, as in your business, your good, your service is vital to national security or the general welfare. And they will come in via eminent domain and just seize it. Yeah, you can sue to get paid later, and yeah, you might get paid on the back end, but there's no dragging your feet. If the government wants your 40,000 ventilators and your excuse is, well, we don't want to because they were made cheaper than the ones we make, that's not going to be a good enough reason. So I don't buy the story that these ventilators, they make it to the market because this company was able to give the US government the middle finger and they couldn't just come in and seize it for, exigent circumstances. If the US government wanted those 40,000, they would have told the company, you've got till tomorrow to comply. And those things better be on, shipping containers or on trucks to where they got to go, or we're sending the guys in the sunglasses and the tacky jackets to come kick your door in. Okay, moving on. We'll jump to page 185, Stakeholder Capitalism and ESG. Oh, this should be a good one. Klaus wrote, over the past 10 years or so, the fundamental changes that have taken place in each of the 5 macro categories reviewed in Chapter 1 have profoundly altered the environment in which companies operate. They have made stakeholder capitalism and environmental social governance, ESG, considerations increasingly relevant to sustainable value creation. ESG can be considered as a yardstick for stakeholder capitalism. The pandemic struck at a time when many different issues, ranging from climate change activism and rising inequalities to gender diversity and Me Too scandals, had already begun to raise awareness and heighten the criticality of stakeholder capitalism and ESG considerations in today's interdependent world. Whether espoused openly or not, nobody would now deny that companies' fundamental purpose can no longer simply be the unbridled pursuit of financial profit. It is now incumbent upon them to serve all stakeholders, not only those who hold shares. This is corroborated by early anecdotal evidence pointing to an even more positive outlook for ESG in the post-pandemic era. This can be explained on 3 fronts. Number 1, crisis will have created or reinforced an acute sense of responsibility and urgency on most issues pertaining to ESG strategies, the most important being climate change. But others, such as consumer behavior, the future of work and mobility, and supply chain responsibility, will move to the forefront of the investment process and will become an integral component of due diligence. 2, the pandemic leaves no doubt in boardrooms that the absence of ESG considerations has the potential to destroy substantial value and even threaten the viability of a business. ESG will therefore become more fully integrated and internalized into the core strategy and governance of a company. It will also alter the way in which investors assess corporate governance. Tax records, dividend payments, and remunerations will become increasingly scrutinized for fear of incurring a reputational cost when a company arises or is made public, when a problem arises. Now, number 3, fostering employee and community goodwill will be key to enhancing a brand's reputation. More and more companies will have to prove that they treat their workers well by welcoming improved labor practices and paying attention to health and safety as well as well-being in the workplace. Companies will not necessarily adhere to these measures because they are genuinely good, but rather because the price of not doing so will be too high in terms of the wrath of activists, both activist investors and social activists. Yeah, right. So he's basically saying, listen, you're going to get on board with ESG or we're going to send the woke mob after you. And that's not going to be good for business now, is it? Right. You guys see life in terms of dollars and cents, but we see this as like a cultural revolution. So the environmental, social, and governance considerations are what you need to bring to the boardroom, because that's what matters to us. Climate change, Me Too scandals, gender diversity, inequality, that all has to come into consideration if we're all going to, be stakeholders in this. And I like how he mentions that it's now incumbent to serve all stakeholders, not only those who hold shares. No, if you don't hold a share in a company that I'm running, you don't have a say. I don't really care. If you're a consumer, yeah, I would like to cater to your needs and give you a product that you want to come back and buy again. But if you're not a shareholder, you don't have a stake. And this is this, again, more communist talk about, well, we're all stakeholders because we all breathe air, right? We're all stakeholders because I guess we're all human beings. It's like, no, you're not a stakeholder because you're just walking around talking and breathing and living. Like, you actually have to have a stake in something to be a stakeholder. This ESG consideration talk is essentially how they leverage companies to bend to their will and carry out the orders and wishes of the World Economic Forum. And if they don't, it's not going to be the World Economic Forum that protests outside their company's headquarters. It's going to be the activists. It's going to be the people who smear paint on windows and doorways of companies. It's going to be people who sit in the middle of the road and won't let you drive down a street to get to work because your car, burns fossil fuel. It's going to be those people they send out. So the ESG is this wedge that they're going to drive in between companies and their profits so that those companies get in line with what the World Economic Forum's agenda is. That's how they do it. That's the method. It's not, we're going to take over the world and you're going to help us. It's, we're going to save the world. And you're going to have no choice, because if you don't help us save the world, you will be the villain, not us. That's the trick. Okay, just in case you didn't know. Moving on to the next section, page 201. This is still under micro reset, industry and business. Klaus wrote, "The pandemic will not do to commercial real estate what it has done to so many other issues, both macro and micro. It will accelerate and amplify the pre-existing trend. The combination of an increase in the number of zombie companies, those that take and use debt to finance more debt and have not generated enough cash over the past few years to cover their interest costs, going bankrupt, and an increase in the number of people working remotely means there will be far fewer tenants to rent empty office buildings. Property developers, for the most part, highly leverage themselves, and will then start experiencing a wave of bankruptcies, with the largest and systemically important ones having to be bailed out by their respective governments. In many prime cities around the world, property prices will therefore fall over a long period of time, puncturing the global real estate bubble that had been in years making. To some extent, the same logic applies to residential real estate in large cities. If the trend of working remotely takes off, the combination of commuting not being in consideration any longer and the absence of job growth means that the younger generation will no longer choose to afford residential renting or buying in expensive cities. Inevitably, prices will then fall. In addition, many will have realized that working from home is more climate-friendly and less stressful than having to commute to an office. The possibility of working remotely means the biggest hubs that have benefited from higher economic growth than other cities or regions in their vicinity may start losing workers to the next tier of rising cities. This phenomenon could in turn create a wave of rising star cities or regions attracting people looking for a better quality of life thanks to more space at more affordable prices." Okay, truth be told, I think that passage right there is 100% true. And I think it's been a long time coming, as he said. What are we witnessing right now in the American economy? And I'm going to do an episode on this once we get done with the Klaus Schwab nonsense, but it's the US dollar being depegged from its role as the world reserve currency. And when that happens, and it is happening, we are going to see a paradigm shift that the world hasn't seen in over 100 years. All reserve currencies whatever era they had been in, whatever century, they all suffered probably the same fate. And it was inflation. It was printing of this currency, because when you're the reserve currency, you're the monopoly money, right? If everyone's at the board, rolling the dice and playing the game from the same stack of monopoly money, why wouldn't you just print more if you needed more of it, right? The problem is, when people get sick and tired of playing that game with your money and want to pick up a different board game with their own money, what do you do with all that cash, all that monopoly money that you printed? Nothing. It's paper. It's crap. It's garbage. Burn it. No one wants it. That's what's going to happen to the US dollar. The trillions of dollars that are in circulation overnight will no longer have use, or will no longer be used as much. This is going to happen. And when that does happen and people wake up and find out that they don't have the purchasing power that they did a year or 2 or 10 ago, they're going to have to reassess their lifestyle. They're not going to want to live in Manhattan or LA or Chicago in these high-rise apartments when it's going to cost them 10 times more. If they can work remotely, they're going to live in the burbs. They're going to live in the country, right? They're not going to want to commute either, because that's going to cost them more money in gas. And it's going to cost them money to park their car every month. This will expedite a mass exodus from the cities. Not that the crime waves that are happening in these major cities hasn't already been kicking that off since the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter riots in the city. I don't know who in their right mind would still be living in the city after that. Forget about what it means for the climate and that nonsense. Like, you want to get out of the city because you're afraid that if a riot kicks off like it did in 2020, your high-rise might be the one they burn down. So yeah, you're going to tell your boss, listen, I can do 90% of my job from home. The other 10%, I'll come downtown and I'll do my office work when I need to. If I need to print something off, or if I need to give a presentation in person, I can do that. But I'm teleworking, boss. Right? This whole boomer mentality of 9 to 5 in it, right? I better see your ass in the seat by 8:45, and don't you dare clock out until 5 p.m. so you can sit in traffic staring at taillights for an hour before you get home, so you can scarf down food, watch whatever bullshit you're watching on TV, and then go to bed so you can get up and do it all over again. People are telling their bosses, I don't feel like doing that anymore, and I don't need to do that anymore. That's old school mentality. I can telework. I'm doing telemedicine with my doctor now, so he's doing it. So that will take over. These cities will become hollowed out, and smaller cities in different areas will start to pop up where the cost of living is cheaper and it's safer, etc. And that might be what America needs. I really hope that does happen. And I want to say Donald Trump mentioned that maybe 3-4 weeks ago. He said, when kicking off his 2024 campaign, saying like he wants to, like, America to found new cities, because we have so much of this wide open space that's not being used. People can get out of these urban hellholes that are traditional American cities and start over, because we have the ability to work remotely. I 100% agree with that passage, and I think that is coming. Commercial real estate is going to tank, and tank badly. Okay, moving on. Page 219, under individual reset. Mr. Schwab said, nothing crystallizes the issue of ethical choice more than the debate that raged during the initial lockdowns about the trade-off between public health and the hit to growth. As said earlier, almost all economists have debunked the myth that sacrificing a few lives will save the economy, but irrespective of these experts' judgment, the debate and arguments went on. In the U.S. in particular, but not exclusively, some policymakers took the line that it was justifiable to value the economy over life, endorsing a policy choice that would have been unimaginable in Asia or Europe, where such pronouncements would have been tantamount to committing political suicide. This realization probably explains UK Prime Minister Johnson's hasty retreat from an initial policy advocating herd immunity, often portrayed by experts and the media as an example of social Darwinism. The prioritization of business over life has a long tradition, running from the merchants of Siena during the Great Plague to those of Hamburg who tried to conceal the cholera outbreak of 1892. However, it seems almost incongruous that it would remain alive today with all the medical and knowledge and scientific data that we have at our disposal. The argument put forward by some groups like Americans for Prosperity is that recessions kill people. This, while undoubtedly true, is a fact that itself is rooted in policy choices informed by ethical considerations. In the U.S., recessions do indeed kill a lot of people because the absence or limited nature of any social safety net makes them life-threatening. How? Well, when people lose their jobs with no state support and no health insurance, they tend to die of despair through suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism, as shown extensively analyzed by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Economic recessions also provoke deaths outside of the U.S., but policy choices in terms of health insurance and worker protection can ensure that there are considerably fewer. This is ultimately a moral choice about whether to prioritize the qualities of individualism or those that favor the destiny of the community. It is an individual as well as collective choice that can be expressed through elections, but the example of the pandemic shows that highly individualized societies are not very good at expressing solidarity. There's where you're wrong, kid. Highly individualized societies promote growth. They promote ideas. They promote the human condition. Societies based upon solidarity promote the status quo. And the status quo will rise to a certain point where it's comfortable and livable and rise no higher than that, which is just malaise. It encourages people to do the bare minimum. People who come from societies that promote the community over the individual get stagnation, right? They get communist collapse. People only work as hard as the next guy because what's in it for them to work any harder? What's in it for them to create something or do something special when no one's going to value their individual contribution? They're just part of the club. They're part of the room. They're a number. And yeah, the lockdowns, people dying of despair and stuff. Well, it was the governments that enforced the lockdowns. So why are you blaming the individuals who want to go and live life normally like they were before when the government is the one that's coming in telling them they can't? So now you're saying, Mr. Schwab, that the government has to lock everybody down, but also has to provide stimmy checks and free healthcare? Like, it's problem, reaction, solution. It's the Hegelian dialectic. You introduce the problem. People react. Don't worry, though, we have a solution. That's how governments do it, right? Introduce the problem, create it, create hysteria. The people react because they're scared sheep, right? But you tell the sheep, hey, we can get through this. We've got a plan for that. And it comes back around to the next problem. Individualized societies aren't perfect. No one's saying that. But the human spirit, if it's allowed to live freely and not trespass against, its fellow man, is what raises all ships, right? The rising tide that raises all ships is the individual on their own personal level who's allowed to do something for himself, for his family, and thereby benefit the community. It's always worked that way. It always will. This pipe dream he's talking about where the ethical choices between saving lives and saving freedom or saving industry, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You just have to tell people that it's going to be a difficult time to get through. We've done this in wars, when we had the Dust Bowl, when there was a depression. Things aren't always going to be sunshine and roses. You're just going to have to get through it on your own. The government cannot be there to save you from every little thing that comes along, because if it conditions you to that lifestyle, you will do nothing for yourself. And then you will just be a number. You will be a face in the crowd. You'll be a cog in the machine. And I don't want that for you. I hope you don't. Okay, let's jump to the last reading, I believe, for this series. Klaus takes us out on page 247 in the conclusion. And he wrote, "There is no denying that COVID-19 virus has more often than not been a personal catastrophe for millions infected by it and for their families and communities. However, at a global level, if viewed in terms of the percentage of the global population affected, the corona crisis is, thus far, one of the least deadly pandemics the world has experienced in over the last 2,000 years. In all likelihood, unless the pandemic evolves in an unforeseen way, the consequences of COVID-19 in terms of health and mortality will be mild compared to previous pandemics. At the end of June 2020, the time the outbreak is still raging in Latin America, South Asia, and much of the U.S., COVID-19 has killed less than 0.006% of the world population. To put this low figure into context in terms of lethality, the Spanish flu killed 2.7% of the world's population and HIV/AIDS 0.6% from 1981 to today. The plague of Justinian, from its onset in 541 AD until it finally disappeared in 750, killed almost one-third of the population of Byzantium, according to various estimates. And the Black Death, 1347 to 1351 AD, is considered to have killed between 30 and 40% of the world population at the time. The corona pandemic is different. It does not constitute an existential threat or a shock that will leave its imprint on the world's population for decades. Okay. Well, how do you like that? Two passages that I 100% agree with. Okay. He calls it out in the conclusion chapter. After 240 some odd pages of all this talk about ESG and how it's going to revolutionize life and how, we all have to think about this from a solidarity perspective and not an individual perspective. He says, truth be told, COVID is not really going to be remembered as that big of a deal. If you take it in the grand context of what mankind has gone through over the last 2,000 years. 0.006% of the world population has succumbed to COVID-19. Since this writing, we could maybe raise that to 0.008%, right? Maybe. Less than a fraction of 1% of the world population has died from this. You look at the Black Death, 30 to 40% of the world died between 1347 and 1351. That is a freaking pandemic. That's scary. I will get in line for a Black Death vaccine if those are my numbers I'm looking at. 0.006%? People, I hope that passage really stuck up here for you, because he was saying it right there. Listen, this really isn't that big of a deal if you take it in the grand scheme of all pandemics that people have had to live through over the last 2,000 years. We're soft, we're weak, we're pansies. Compared to what they went through in Byzantium and in Europe during the Black Death, people would laugh at that. People would literally laugh to hear that was your survivability rate when 30 to 40% of the world was dropping dead from Black Death. And that wasn't a pretty death, by the way. Ring Around the Rosie, that nursery rhyme, Pocket Full of Posy, they put flowers in people's pockets to cover up the stink of your dead body, because you would get these big pustules that would pop and have red rings around them as you were dying of the Black Plague. And then you would almost have this gangrenous rot. It was a really ugly way to go. And back then people had no idea what communicable disease was. They thought it might have been a curse, they knew you were sick, but they didn't know how pathogens or viruses or bacteria worked. People just did what they thought was the right thing to avoid dying from it. And 30 to 40% of the population still died anyway. That was a real pandemic. That was real struggle. That was real pain. The COVID-19 saga of our modern age shows us how pampered we are. It shows us how chicken we can be. After 2021, I was pretty much done with it. When 2021 arrived and people weren't dropping like flies, and there wasn't some guy with sackcloth with his wagon wheel going down your street saying, "Bring out your dead." When that wasn't going on, I knew that this was all fabricated, that this was mostly, if not completely, a psychological operation on the world's population to just follow orders, to socially distance, to stay home, to get yourself vaccinated, get your kids vaccinated, get yourself boosted, get your kids boosted, make us that money. And it's no coincidence that Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum saw the opportunity that this presented, because it was psychological. And that's the main theme, is that this was an opportunity for them to usher you into a new way of thinking. You were not going to die from it. The vast, vast majority of people were not even going to go to a hospital for this. It was going to come and go, but that window between 2020 and 2023 was where they were going to try to make it happen. And I think they've largely failed, because most people, like myself, have just said, yeah, we're done with it. We're not having this anymore, so we're sick of it. Pun intended. Yeah, okay, folks. That is the conclusion of Covid-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Martin Schwab of the World Economic Forum. I hope you've enjoyed. We are going to pick up next time with his final book, The Great Narrative for a Better Future. Doesn't that sound cozy? Yeah, this is about 200 some pages. Covid-19 was his longest of his 3 books. But yeah, we're going to see what he says in this. And my guess, it's more communist gobbledygook about ESG and how we're all in this together, and how AI is going to be your buddy. And we're all going to live in the box and eat the bugs. And it's going to be beautiful. But we'll see. I could be wrong. But that's my hunch. Anyway, if you're liking the series, if you're liking the channel, if you're liking any of this, give us a thumbs up, share it with family or friends, leave a comment down below. I do try to reply to comments when I see them. Like I said, I have no misgivings about these videos. I'm saying words like COVID and vaccine and Klaus Schwab and World Economic Forum. I think I cursed for the first time in a video there. So yeah, this is probably going to get throttled and censored. So I won't be surprised if this gets pulled back like the last video. So do us a favor, thumbs up, comment, and share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we will see you back next time for The Great Narrative. Till then, again, happy Easter and take it easy.